Yes, I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then launch into that campaign. Please stop me at any point you want to question me and so forth.
Yes.
So my name's My name's Stephen Speakman. I live in Stockport. I'm chairman of Manchester Civic Society. I'm now retired. I've been chairman for several years since the death of the prior chairman, Mr. John Kershaw. And we're what you might expect involved in things like conservation matters, heritage. We have trips and events. For instance, this coming Thursday, we have a talk from the Guide Dogs for the Blind people.
Oh, yeah.
And on Wednesday, I'm going out with somebody from another blind organisation looking at bus stops and so on. So we get involved in things to do with the civic landscape. And along the weary way, I was approached on one or two occasions by people who said, look, we can't transact. There was one chap, for instance, he had limitations, learning difficulties. He drove, he built things, he kept his house, but he had no electronic means of communication. Now, at the time, 3 years or so ago that he approached me, his wife was in hospital, Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, and she, as it turned out, sadly, she was dying. And he would go along and spend long days in the hospital, and he couldn't transact. He couldn't go to the cafe or the shop because he just had coin and note. He didn't have any electronic means of communication. And I'd heard about a few of these things. So I got involved first off with Stepping Hill, and they lent me their ear, and I explained the situation, and I pushed for a change in policy, and I was successful with that. Very grateful to the fact that Stepping Hill listened, and they brought back coin and note to the shop and the cafeteria where it still is. And I put my thinking cap on then. I started speaking to various people, and we formulated a campaign. And along that way, I spoke to management in many institutions. I mean, it's a real swathe of institutions. Places like Manchester Museum, the Whitworth Art Gallery, the Lowry Galleries in Salford. These are all big players. They've got big refectories and shops and this kind of thing. The Imperial War Museum, Green King pubs, because 10% of them had gone cashless at one stage. And I got interviewed by Nigel Farage on GB News about this.
All right.
It was picked up from the press, and Nigel Farage interviewed me, quite a lengthy interview actually, and was quite championing or supportive of it. And then I also got on BBC Breakfast TV after that, and I went on a number of local radio stations, and I'm just thinking 3 weeks ago I had a significant article in the Manchester Evening News. So it gathered momentum, and it's quite funny sometimes. People ring me up from places like Essex and say, what can you do about it? Which, I don't live in Essex, but I have, along that campaign trail, I was contacted by a gentleman called Ron Del Navo from Edinburgh. And he's very active and a leader of what's called the Payment Choice Alliance.
Oh, yeah.
And Yeah, he sat on an all-party parliamentary committee just recently this year, who are looking at cash, and he is pushing for legislation, the kind of thing they've got in France and Spain and the Netherlands and Norway and I think Austria now, where you're obliged in major institutions to accept cash because it precludes so many people, not just disabled or learning difficulty people, blind people, people who choose to use cash as a means of budgeting. You'd be surprised, there's lots of those who approach me and say, look, we want to use cash. To give you a flavour of that, somebody approached me about the new digital cafes, and it was in the national press as well, this was, for Tesco. So I went along to a local Tesco store at a nearby, well, it's a group of stores there. And I spoke to the staff, and they were all, or as they always are, the young staff always want cash back for two reasons. Number one, they find it embarrassing to turn people away, particularly people who are in the care of social services, say in a wheelchair, because they can't use each other's means of payment. And the rule is they've got to use cash. But number two, they actually, their tips fall through the floor if they lose physical cash. So I spoke to the girls behind the counter at this particular store, and they were very glum about the prospect of having no cash. And I got on to management there, took it up, and I was really surprised because some of these, like the Imperial War Museum North, took months and months of pushing and negotiating and contacting. But Tesco, and remember there's 40 of these digital stores, came back and said, yes, you have a point. And now when you go to that particular store, there is, it says cash, and they've got a till there, and there's usually a line of people there at the till, and they brought back cash. So some have been easy, some have been hard, but I believe it's vitally important, principally as a civic society. It's been vitally important because we've thought of access in the civic landscape. Without that access, you are stranded. You're cut off from transacting, and many people there be thereat. But also, what is encroachingly clear, and whatever you put politics, is that once cash disappears, you are entering into a world where you lose competence to transact manually, and you lose potentially liberty. Once it can be seen and tracked and traced, you may become like a puppet on a string. So there are very, very real concerns and considerations here on retaining cash. And I've generally found that it's been an excellent response. When I've raised it, I'm not saying I don't meet any opposition, but particularly in public bodies, the management say, oh yeah, we hadn't thought of that angle. I say to them, well, sometimes I'm quite cheeky to them. I say, well, you're on more money than you can shake a stick at. You should have thought of this, because it shouldn't mean me, chairman of a small civic society, having to come along and tell you, stating the obvious. And it's quite, when you speak to the staff on the ground, like I remember the young woman who's the manager of the cafe in Manchester Museum. And, they're so eager. Oh, we need it back it's just quite disgraceful. We're having to give out cups of tea for free. How can they do this? You know, they take over the campaign for you. So there's quite an enthusiasm, and it's not just old people. They're all delighted.
It's funny that you mentioned Tesco, because it's not my supermarket of choice, but I did happen to go into the big Tesco locally to us the other week. And when I got to the checkout, of course, there was none of the normal checkouts, so it was a big queue at the one that was open. So I went down to the self-checkouts, and there must have been 20, I think, of these self-checkouts. And when I started looking at them, each one had got a big notice on it saying it's card only. Mm. So when I got to the exit, I said to the girl, I said, all of your machines, are they all card only? And she said, no, there's that one right down at the end there, that takes cash. So they're actively trying to dissuade people from using it, is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, no, you're quite right here. It's the definite direction of travel. You know, you get hotel groups saying, oh, for your convenience, we've done away with cash. Well, it's not for my convenience, it's for yours, you know. I mean, they're just driving that agenda. And of course, perhaps it's not difficult to see why. There are advantages to being cashless, but what we say is that the biggest disadvantage of all to all of us is if cash disappears, because then we've lost our liberty, our freedom, our independence to transact privately. And, you know, there are concerns. We don't know what's coming down the track in the future. We need legislation.
Well, I had Alan Miller on last week of the Together Federation, and they are very strongly in favour of continuing to use cash, and very concerned about digital ID cards. And you can see that digital payment is the precursor to digital ID cards, isn't it?
100%. It smooths the path to that direction. And, you know, there are all sorts of concerns and considerations, but I think in the end, the one around the topic of liberty will become more and more predominant and important. So we keep this campaign up, and, you know, I will go into a pub that doesn't take cash and challenge and speak to the landlord and persuade as far as I can. I have people coming back off coach trips. I had a young gentleman, by the way, who came to me the other week. He'd been to the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the whole endeavour was now cashless. Not just going in, but, you know, the cafeteria and the shop. And I spoke to them at length. I managed to get up to middle and then senior management. I wrote to them. I passed it to Ron Del Navo of the Payment Choice Alliance. I kind of think of him as the big guns that I pass it over to. And he is now roped in the Arts Council. And what he's saying, and I mean, I'm putting the same argument like at the Palace Theatre here in Manchester, which is part of a big national chain. They're cashless. And we're saying, look, you get a lot of public funding. You shouldn't be precluding any members of the public, because as soon as you go cashless, there are inevitably some members of the public who are precluded. Well, if it's you know, if you're receiving public funds, which a lot of these theatres are, then they should not be precluding these people. So the fight goes on here. I mean, you know, I think I'm hopeful, and I say this in a non-party political sense, big emphasis, but whatever party garners power, or has got it at the moment in the case of the Labour Party, but whichever party comes to power, it's absolutely vital that they wake up to this truth that we need cash protecting and we need legislation thereat. I understand that there will always be, some people argue if you're a lone van selling drinks or whatever away from people, you're more vulnerable and they want to go with card. Though the majority don't, incidentally. The majority of smaller players want to keep cash because they don't have the transaction fees to bother with. But you could have exceptions like that. But for the bulk and wheel, big hospitals, theatres, public houses, I really think we need legislation to protect cash usage. So we carry on with this campaign, and I try wherever possible, if I come across cases, to fight the good fight and get them back to using it. So that's my story on it.
I don't know how much you're aware. There is another element to this whereby, you were speaking to Nigel the other week, and he was debanked when he was with Coutts, I think it was. And the banks and the state are definitely in collusion on this. And they use generally money laundering regulations to hide behind it. I'm involved in a hospitality business which generates cash. Now, the bank account that we've got, it won't take cash. You can't pay cash into it. There's no mechanism for doing it. So the only way that we can take this cash and put it into the company is to put it in through a personal account. So I have to go along and put the money into my personal account and then transfer it into the company account. It says a nuisance, but you say, well, fair enough, you do that. But then what you find when you try to pay more than a certain amount in, this is done through post offices, and they won't take it. So you put £2,000 in, and it takes it, and then a week later you go to put another £1,000 in. It says, well, you've reached your paying limit for the month.
Well, this has been specifically a growing concern that the Payment Choice Alliance nationally have taken up. The retreat of high street banks and facilities, the limitations where, as you rightly point out, there's perhaps a small post office who's not geared up for business banking. There are real concerns around cash access here. And, there are mechanisms. Ron was telling me the other day, I think he said in Belgium, they've got paying in facilities on the high street, far more sophisticated. And also, incidentally, you get some communities, like I went with my family to Borth in West Wales this summer. And, trolling about there and going on the beach and so on, there was one cash point. It's a very long, linear village. And this cash point was broken. And I asked the man inside the store, and he said, oh, it's been broken for months. And people come in here and they can't get money from us. And he told me a tale of one chap who went to there was an Indian takeaway across the road. And he said he went for his meal that he was taking back to a caravan park, bought the meal, and when it came to pay, he could only, he needed cash because they only took cash because they want to avoid the transaction fees. So he went to the cash point, couldn't get cash, and then, had to go 2 villages away. Well, to McKinley, actually. Well, when he came back, the guy in the shop was telling me, he said he was raving because the meal had all gone cold. So there are very real practical problems, and whether it's commercial problems for businesses, which are major, because businesses are being driven to cashlessness. Now, a lot of smaller businesses stick to cash because they avoid the charges. But, it becomes a real headache, really difficult for them, as you're pointing out, to pay in, to draw out, to find somewhere that's open or accessible. And of course, that is the case in many smaller communities as well. Whereas even 20 years ago, they'd have had access. People had much more access than they do now. Ron tells me from his endeavours at a far more sophisticated level than me that where the link machines are concerned, the actual margin on the link machines for profit every time you do a transaction does not compare to the continent, where they get a very greater or more substantial return on having cash machines. So what we're saying there, as Ron points out to me, there isn't the incentive to have the cash machines. And again, they get broken and left, or there aren't many of them. So there's a real issue around cash. I always come back to this, that whether it's from the commercial side or the individual side, what we need to do is wake up and see that once cash is gone, it's gone. And shall we say, we'll end up like puppets on a string, doing as we're told. So there needs to be a big turnaround on cash. And ultimately, I think it must be politically contrived, that turnaround.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you do hear, I've heard stories of people not only going to their own bank and asking to take out a significant amount of cash out of the account, and they've been refused. They say, the bank says, you want, £3,000, what do you want it for? And you rightly said earlier that the privacy element of this is very important, and I think it is.
Yeah, and there's encroaching legislation around this topic, and it's very worrisome. I mean, I emphasise that we, as a civic society, are not speaking in a politically aligned manner, but whoever has their hands on the levers of power, it's not difficult to see this direction of travel and the very real concerns going into the future. And in the civic landscape, I mentioned the example there of a rural community in Wales in that particular case, but this replicates all over the country. There are many, many people being cut off from cash in any meaningful sense and being driven to transact electronically where they would otherwise choose to use cash. So it's a tall order, it's a big issue, it's very much an issue of the day, but in my small way, I've tried to be tenacious about it. I've tried to make a difference, and I'm very pleased to be able to say that I have managed to turn around a significant number of institutions. And two of them that I turned around, I mentioned one earlier, which was Stepping Hill Hospital, but also Manchester Royal Infirmary. It's quite amazing that when you speak to senior staff, they say things like, "Oh, right, well, I hadn't thought about that." I say, really? I was in Manchester Royal the other day, and I went in the cafe. I was collecting a prescription for somebody I know, and went to the cafe afterwards, and I was pleased to see the till jingling away. A lot of people were paying with cash, but they couldn't do just a short while prior. It was impossible. And when I raised this, I said, well, your hospital, you get the halt, the lame, the blind, the elderly. you get young and old, you get all sorts of people, obviously, and there's bound to be a proportion of them who cannot access the services, food and drink, because, they solely use cash. And you haven't got cash, really? Yeah. It's a good point. We'll look at this. And they turned it round. So I'd say to anybody who sees this interview, if you go into an establishment, you're meant to pay by cash, but you couldn't, take it up. A few words can make a big difference. And you'll be amazed how many people agree with you. Certainly, as I say, lots of the younger staff, because their tips. What a good story there. I went back to check on the cafe and the shop at Buxton Pavilion Gardens. They were entirely cashless. I got them back, and I had to get counsellors involved because the company that was managing were most reluctant. And I had to push the envelope. Got the shop back first, and then I got the cafe. So I went back, to police it and see it was still running a couple of months later. And as I entered the shop, I went and bought coffee and a piece of cake. And the young fella behind the counter, he said, are you the guy that got cash back? I said, yes, that's me. I want to shake your hand, matey, he said. That's great. I said, why? What? He said, we it was embarrassing turning a lot of the elderly, and you get a lot of elderly wheelchair bound and so on in Buxton, as you might imagine, Spa Town. But he said, our tips have gone up fourfold. So, he was really delighted. So, there it is in all sorts of ways. You can have an impact. Now, I know most people won't go to the lengths that I have done as chairman of the Civic Society, like that one at Buxton. I had to fight tooth and nail for that. I couldn't let it go. And it took me several months. But I've had quite a few.
One of the problems, I think, Stephen, is that the card system has got the tacit backing of the government and all of the establishment, really. I mean, from the government's point of view, they don't really like cash because they can't guarantee that if I pay you in cash for something, that money I'm paying you with hasn't been taxed, to put it bluntly. And so
absolutely,
there's a loss of control from their point of view in terms of making sure that they've got the taxation from it.
No, look, who can deny that? I would say the potential, marching forward into the future, the potential loss of whole-scale loss of liberty by losing cash is actually a far more serious concern than the government not raising its tax revenues inexorably upwards. And also, it is meritorious to note that there are many frauds online. A lot of people lose cash. I think every 2 minutes a mobile phone is stolen in London and so forth. So there are negatives to both sides. And yes, look, I mean, I get it. There are advantages to cashless. If I was going buying say a new settee or some big item like that, I would probably use my card. It's a no-brainer. But I don't want restricting, and I certainly don't want to be told when I go in a cafe, I can't buy a coffee with note and coin. I can't buy a sandwich. That's not on. It's too heavy an intrusion into my choice. So, I'm very hopeful that whichever power is in power, next you may say, you would say it's likely to be the Reform Party. Well, let's hope if it is the Reform Party, they put something in place to ensure that you can't just refuse cash, particularly if you're taking public money, like the big players like the Royal Shakespeare Company and so on. Let's hope that there is some defence by politicians down the track of whatever persuasion of cash. And I do believe, from what Rondell Navo of the Payment Choice Alliance tells me, he's monitoring this in Parliament. He's got contacts in Parliament and he sits on various committees with them about this. And he said, to be fair, across the piece, there's growing enthusiasm amongst MPs of various persuasions individually. That's not to say, and that's your point, it's the government. That's not to say it's the government. But there are plenty of individual MPs who see the worth of the retention of cash.
Right. Well, look, thanks very much indeed for being on the podcast and explaining to us what you're up to. It's very interesting. I can assure you that if Reform UK ever get into power, that we will keep cash, and I would hope that we'll legislate in order to ensure that businesses have to accept legal tender in cash. Whether we'll probably won't be one of the first things, because we'll have a lot to do when we get into power, but it will be one of the things I'm sure we'll do. Thanks again for being on to bring this to people's attention, and congratulations on all the successes you've had in terms of allowing people the flexibility to pay in cash if they need to.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the time, and thank you for interviewing me. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Good. Thanks again, Stephen.
Bye.
Bye now.